She stood at the altar in white, and the man beside her was not her groom. He was her father, and next to him stood the woman he had spent 15 years learning to hate, his ex-wife, his daughter's mother, the woman who, on that very day, would reveal a secret so devastating. It would rewrite every painful memory David had ever carried, and when the truth finally came out, neither of them would ever be the same again. Hello friends, welcome to our story. Before we begin, I want to say, if you are someone who has ever loved someone deeply and lost them, not to death but to silence and distance, this story is for you. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Are you in New York, London, Canada, Nigeria, South Africa, Australia? Wherever you are so welcome here. Now, let us begin. The church bells began ringing long before the ceremony started. Soft, slow, heavy, like a memory that refused to stay buried. Outside the chapel, guests gathered beneath pale autumn sunlight. Women adjusted dresses. Men fixed their ties. Quiet laughter floated through the cool morning air. But near the far end of the parking lot, one man stood frozen. His hands trembled around a folded invitation. A wedding invitation. His daughter's wedding. And 20 feet away stood the woman he had spent 15 years trying to forget. His ex-wife. She hadn't seen him yet. She stood near a maple tree, holding a small clutch purse, staring toward the chapel doors. Her hair was streaked with silver now. Her shoulders carried the invisible weight of time. For a moment, she looked exactly the same, and completely different. David Mercer swallowed hard. He had imagined this moment hundreds of times over the years. Sometimes with anger, sometimes with words he thought he would finally say, sometimes with a cold, quiet revenge that never came. But now that she stood there, nothing came. Only silence, only memory, only the sound of old wounds waking up after a very long sleep. Because 15 years ago, their marriage had not ended with peace. It ended with slammed doors, with accusations thrown across kitchen counters at midnight, with tears that slowly turned into bitterness, and with a silence so thick, it eventually became the only language they knew. And now, of all the places life could have placed them, fate had brought them back together. Not for love, not for any second chance, but for one singular, unavoidable reason: to walk their daughter down the aisle, together. And neither of them knew that this wedding would uncover something far greater than old pain. It would reveal a truth both had spent years running from. A truth that could either destroy what little remained between them, or finally, mercifully, set them both free. People often believe that divorce ends a story, that when signatures dry on legal paper, emotions disappear with them, that people move on cleanly, neatly, like chapters closing in a book. But that is not how life works. Some endings do not end. They simply wait. They sleep quietly beneath years of distance and distraction, until one day, something forces them back into the light. For David, that day arrived inside a cream-colored envelope. A handwritten note from his daughter, Emma. Simple, careful, almost nervous in its tone. The handwriting was hers. He recognized it immediately, the way she curled the tail of every letter G, just like her mother always did. The note said, "Dad, I want both of you there. Together." 3 words hit him harder than anything else on that page. Together, not separately, not with careful scheduling to avoid crossing paths. Together. And David sat at his kitchen table for a very long time after reading that, staring at nothing, because he genuinely did not know how to answer. Before bitterness entered their home and made itself comfortable, David and Elaine had once been the kind of couple that other people quietly envied. They met in college during their junior year. He was studying civil engineering. She was studying communications. He was quiet and deliberate. A man who listened more than he spoke, who remembered small details, who showed love through consistency rather than grand gestures. She was sunlight, loud laughter, sharp wit, the kind of woman who filled every room she entered and made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. Their love was ordinary in the best possible way. Long drives with the windows down, shared coffee on Sunday mornings, late-night grocery runs where they always came home with things they didn't need, arguments about paint colors that lasted 3 weeks, small traditions, slow routines, the kind of life that feels invisible while you're living it, and irreplaceable once it's gone. And then came Emma, their daughter, the center of everything. When Emma was born, David stood in that hospital room and cried harder than he had at his own wedding. Elaine teased him gently about it for years afterward. Their home was small. Money was often tight. But they were building something. Not perfect, but real. The kind of life many people spend their whole lives searching for. Until life began pressing against the cracks they had not noticed were forming. David started working longer hours, taking on more projects, telling himself it was for the family, for the future, for security. Elaine felt increasingly alone. She would put Emma to bed, sit in the living room in the dark, and wait for headlights to pull into the driveway. Some nights they came early. Some nights they did not. Small frustrations quietly became recurring arguments. Unspoken resentment grew like weeds in a garden that no one had time to tend. There was no dramatic betrayal, no catastrophic event, no single night that broke everything. Just years of emotional distance, accumulating like dust on surfaces nobody thought to wipe. Emma noticed before either of them admitted it. Children always notice. She noticed the silence at dinner, the way her father would come home and eat reheated food alone at the counter, the way her mother would go to bed before he arrived. Conversations reduced to logistics, schedules, pickups and drop-offs. She stopped bringing friends home because the air inside the house felt different from other houses, and she did not know how to explain why. One night, she was 9 years old. Emma overheard something through her bedroom wall that she would never forget. Her mother crying softly in the kitchen, her father sitting at the table, neither looking at the other, and then Elaine's voice, quiet and exhausted, "I don't even know who we are anymore." That sentence changed everything. Because sometimes marriages do not collapse in one defining moment. They disappear slowly, piece by piece, like a photograph left too long in the sun, until one day you hold it up and can barely recognize the people in it. The divorce was ugly, painfully, unnecessarily ugly. Friends divided themselves between sides. Family members stopped attending the same gatherings. Lawyers spoke louder than any emotion either of them tried to express. And Emma stood in the middle of it all, too young to be asked, old enough to feel every fracture running through the foundation of everything she had known. David blamed Elaine for pulling away. Elaine blamed David for never being present. Neither admitted how frightened they truly were beneath all that anger. And after the papers were signed and the house was sold, they stopped speaking entirely. Birthdays became separate celebrations held on different days. Holidays became carefully negotiated schedules. Emma's school performances became exercises in strategic seating, her parents on opposite sides of the auditorium, applauding the same child from a careful distance. Years passed. The distance hardened, and bitterness stopped feeling like pain. It began to feel like normal, like just the way things were. But deep inside, neither David nor Elaine had fully healed. They had only learned how to live without touching the wound. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, go ahead and drop a comment right now. Tell us, have you ever had to be in the same room as someone you once loved and lost? We would really love to hear from you. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 14 years after the divorce. David was sitting at his desk reviewing blueprints when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost let it ring. But some quiet instinct he could not name, made him answer. Dad. Emma's voice. Older now. Warm. But nervous in a way that made him sit up straighter. He smiled the moment he heard her. They spoke regularly, always had. But something in her tone felt different today. She started carefully, talking about work, about the apartment she had just repainted, about a trip she had taken with friends. And then she paused. Longer than normal. I'm getting married, Dad. David put down his pen. He forgot to breathe for a moment. And then he laughed. The kind of laugh that comes out when joy is too large for the body to contain quietly. Tears formed instantly without permission. His little girl. His Emma. He asked about the proposal. About the ring. About the young man. A good man, she said, patient and kind and steady. Someone who made her feel safe. David liked him immediately, just from the sound of how she described him. And then came another pause. Longer. Careful. Dad. There's something else. He leaned back slowly. Waiting. I want both of you to walk me down the aisle. The room went quiet. Outside, rain continued tapping against the window in soft, steady rhythms. David stared at the wall across from him. He said nothing for a long moment. Emma's voice came again, softer. I know it's complicated. I know everything that happened between you. But I don't want to choose. I never wanted to choose. The words settled over him like something heavy and true. Because that was the hidden burden children of divorce carry that nobody talks about. They spend years performing wholeness, pretending they are fine, smiling at separate birthday parties, navigating two households with two sets of rules and two emotional climates, privately learning how to divide themselves so that neither parent feels like the lesser choice. David closed his eyes. He imagined standing beside Elaine. Actually standing beside her. In public. In a church. In front of everyone. The woman who had once known every detail of who he was. The woman who had later become a stranger wearing a familiar face. He wanted to say no. The word was right there. Ready. But then Emma whispered something that cut straight through 15 years of carefully constructed walls. I just want one day where I don't feel like I'm standing in between you. David opened his eyes. The rain kept falling. And something inside him shifted. Not dramatically, not with fireworks, just quietly, like a door unlocking in a room he had kept sealed for too long. 3 days later, he typed a message he never imagined sending. Simple. No warmth, no coldness. Just words. Elaine, we should talk. For Emma. He stared at it for a long time before sending it. And when he finally pressed send, he exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for 15 years. They agreed to meet at a small cafe, neutral ground, somewhere with no history living in its walls. David arrived early. He always did when his nerves were involved. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and dark roasted coffee. Outside, dry leaves drifted across the sidewalk in small spirals. He chose a table near the window and sat with his hands folded, watching the door. His coffee grew cold before he touched it. Then she walked in. Elaine. She wore a dark coat and moved through the cafe the same way she always had. Purposefully, aware of the room without being showy about it. She spotted him immediately. Neither smiled. Neither moved quickly. She settled into the chair across from him and placed her bag on the floor carefully. A small table between them, 15 years between them. The silence felt enormous enough to be a third person sitting with them. "Thank you for coming," David said. Elaine nodded once. "Emma called me too." There it was. The shared obligation. The reason that was larger than either of them. For several minutes they spoke carefully, like strangers who had been warned about each other but were trying to be polite. Weather, travel arrangements, wedding details. Safe, surface-level words that touched nothing real. But beneath the conversation, beneath the careful language and the measured eye contact, old emotions moved. Not dramatically, just quietly shifting, the way furniture looks slightly different when you return to a room after years away. He noticed the way she still stirred her coffee counterclockwise. She noticed the way he still rubbed his thumb across the rim of the cup when he was anxious. Tiny habits, survived by memory. And then, without any real warning, Elaine looked at him directly. "I spent years thinking you hated me." David blinked. The sentence landed differently than he expected. He looked down at the table. "I thought you hated me too," he said. Neither of them had planned for honesty to arrive that quickly. But truth has its own timing, and it rarely asks permission. Elaine exhaled slowly. "We wasted so many years blaming each other." David nodded. "And maybe we still do." Outside, the city moved past the window. Ordinary Tuesday life. Inside the cafe, something was changing. Slowly, without fanfare. Elaine said, quietly, "I was angry because I felt invisible." David looked at her. "And I was angry because I felt like I had failed." No accusations. No voices rising. Just two people, finally, telling the truth about things that had happened long ago and mattered deeply still. And for the first time in 15 years, they listened to each other. Not to build a counter-argument. Not to protect themselves. But to actually understand. They met again the following week. And the week after that. Not to repair a marriage. Neither of them wanted that, and neither pretended otherwise. But to prepare for something that required them to be in the same room without destroying it. Some of those meetings were awkward and ended with long silences in parking lots. Some reopened old wounds that had never fully closed. One afternoon in October, an old argument resurfaced. Something about a decision made during the divorce, money, a misunderstanding that had calcified into a grievance over the years. Voices rose. Elaine pushed back from the table. She stood up, reached for her coat, and David thought, this is it. This is where it ends again. But she stopped at the door, her hand on the handle, and she stood there for a moment without turning around. Then, quietly, she came back to the table and sat down. "I don't want to keep doing this," she said. "I'm tired." David looked at her. "So am I." And that admission, that shared exhaustion, became the first real foundation they had built together in over a decade. Please take a second right now to like this video if the story is resonating with you. And subscribe if you haven't yet, so you never miss a story like this one. Conversations gradually became softer, less guarded. They discovered, carefully, that they could talk about Emma without the conversation becoming a battlefield. They discovered that they shared the same quiet pride about who their daughter had become, the same disbelief that time had moved so quickly, the same private guilt about the years Emma had spent managing their separation. And slowly, the weight of shared parenthood became something that connected rather than divided. Then one evening in early November, about 3 weeks before the wedding, they sat in a quiet restaurant working through the final logistics. Seating arrangements, the processional order, who would say what and when. The restaurant was nearly empty. Rain tapped gently against the glass. Soft music moved through the room. And then Elaine went quiet. A different kind of quiet. David noticed immediately. He recognized it. The way she would go still when something was pressing heavily against her from the inside. "What is it?" he asked. She stared into her glass. Her jaw tightened slightly. Then she looked at him. "There's something I never told you," she said. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." David set down his fork. He waited. She inhaled slowly, the way someone breathes before stepping off a ledge they have been standing near for years. "The year before our divorce." She paused. "I was diagnosed with clinical depression." David did not move. She continued. "I hid it. I was ashamed of it. I thought I could manage it on my own without anyone knowing. I didn't want you to see me falling apart. I didn't know how to let you." His face changed. He could feel it changing. Because suddenly, in the space of a few seconds, 15 years of stored memory began rearranging itself. The distance, the long silences, the weeks when she would barely speak, the nights when she went to bed before 8 and he stood in the hallway outside their bedroom door not knowing whether to knock. The coldness he had experienced as rejection. The withdrawal he had interpreted as evidence that she no longer loved him. The wall she had built that he had spent years assuming she constructed specifically to keep him out. Elaine wiped the corner of her eye. "I wasn't pulling away from you because I didn't care," she said. "I was drowning, and I didn't know how to ask for a life jacket." David sat completely still. 15 years. 15 years of carrying a story that was built on incomplete information. 15 years of a wound that had never been properly explained, only felt and then concluded. He whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" Elaine smiled sadly, the kind of smile that carries too many regrets to list. "Because I was terrified," she said. "And by the time I realized I needed help, I thought it was too late." The room was quiet around them. No dramatic music. No rising voices. Just rain on glass and the sound of truth arriving far too late and somehow still exactly on time. David looked out the window. His throat tightened. "I thought you stopped loving me," he said quietly. "I thought everything I did was wrong and eventually you just gave up." Elaine looked at him across the table. Her eyes were full. "I never stopped," she said. "I was just lost, and I didn't know how to find my way back." The silence that followed was not cold. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had spent over a decade blaming themselves and each other for a collision that neither of them fully understood until now. And in that silence, David felt something extraordinary happen inside his chest. The anger he had carried, that heavy, familiar, load-bearing anger that had become part of his daily architecture, began to shift. It did not vanish. It did not disappear cleanly, but it loosened, like a fist slowly unclenching after years of being clenched so tightly that the person had forgotten they were doing it. He reached across the table, and he covered her hand with his, not romantically, not with any suggestion of what it once was, but with something simpler and in many ways far more powerful. With the understanding of one human being for another who had suffered quietly for too long. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not seeing it." Elaine closed her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't let you." And that night, for the first time since their divorce, they stayed at the table until the restaurant began to close around them. Not because there was anything left to resolve, but because neither of them was ready to stop being understood. The wedding morning arrived beneath a sky so golden it looked painted. The chapel filled slowly with guests in warm colors, soft conversation, the smell of fresh flowers and candle wax. A string quartet played near the entrance. Outside, the trees had held onto the last of their autumn leaves as if waiting for permission to finally let go. Emma stood in the bridal suite on the second floor. Her dress was simple and stunning, long, ivory, with small pearl details along the sleeves. Her hands shook slightly, Her eyes were bright and emotional and beautiful. Her bridesmaids moved around her, adjusting, laughing softly, handing her things. And then there was a knock at the door. She looked up. It opened slowly. David stepped in first. Then Elaine just behind him. Emma stared, and her face broke open. Not with distress, with relief. A relief so deep it looked like it had been living in her chest for years, waiting for exactly this moment. Because for the first time in her adult memory, her parents stood in the same room without tension living in the air between them. Without the invisible wall she had always felt, even when they were being civil, even when they were trying. They just stood there, together, peacefully, like two people who had finally put something down that they had been carrying far too long. David crossed the room and kissed her forehead. His eyes were already wet. Elaine stepped forward and adjusted the small pearl pin in Emma's hair. Gently, the way mothers do when words are not enough. The three of them stood together. A family in a new shape, broken in places, rebuilt in others, but whole in the way that matters most, in intention, in love, in the willingness to show up despite the difficulty of it. The ceremony began. The chapel doors opened. Music swelled through the room and guests rose to their feet. And then David and Elaine walked their daughter down the aisle. Side by side, matching steps, not as lovers, not as enemies, but as two people who had chosen, finally and deliberately, to lay down the past for the sake of someone they both loved more than they had ever loved their own pain. Emma held both their arms. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks. Guests watched quietly, some of them not knowing the full story, but feeling every word of it anyway in the atmosphere of that walk. Because love is visible when it has been earned through difficulty. And forgiveness, real forgiveness, has a presence in a room that everyone can feel even when nobody speaks of it. At the altar, Emma turned to them both before releasing their arms. She looked at her father, then at her mother. Then she whispered, "Thank you." Just that. 2 words, but they carried the weight of years, of divided holidays, of careful scheduling, of all the moments she had silently wished for exactly this. David nodded. Elaine pressed her hand once and smiled, and then Emma turned to face the man waiting for her at the altar, and she smiled the most unguarded smile of her entire life. After the ceremony, the reception spilled out into a garden strung with warm lights. Music moved through the evening air. People danced. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell like tides. David stood near the edge of the garden, hands in his pockets, watching Emma and her new husband move through the crowd. Elaine came and stood beside him quietly, a glass of sparkling water in her hand. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched their daughter, happy, free, luminous in a way that felt like something they had both contributed to without fully realizing it. "We did okay," David said eventually. Elaine considered this for a moment. "Eventually," she said, and they both smiled. Not at each other exactly, but at the evening, at Emma. At the long, strange, painful, necessary road that had somehow led them here. There was no romantic reunion, no dramatic declaration, no suggestion that what was broken could be rebuilt into what it once was. Because this was not that kind of story. This was something quieter, and in many ways more meaningful. This was two people finally releasing each other from years of unspoken blame. Finally seeing each other clearly, not as the villains of their own stories, but as two wounded human beings who had done the best they could with what they understood at the time, and choosing, even late, even imperfectly, to offer grace anyway. Because forgiveness does not always arrive the way we imagine it will. It is rarely a sudden rush of emotion. It rarely comes with music or a beautiful speech. Most of the time it comes quietly, It comes in a cafe on a Tuesday afternoon when you finally stop rehearsing your argument long enough to listen. It comes in a restaurant when someone says, "I was drowning," and you realize the story you thought you knew was never the complete one. It comes when you choose to walk beside someone not because the past has been erased, but because something, a child, a moment, a single fragile act of courage, is more important than the weight you've been carrying. And sometimes, forgiveness does not rebuild what was lost. Sometimes it simply returns your hands to you, empty, open, ready to hold something new. If the story moved you even a little, please go ahead and like this video right now. It genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And subscribe to this channel. Every week, we bring you real emotional stories about real human experiences. Stories about love, loss, healing, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going. Tell us in the comments, what did this story make you feel? Have you ever had to forgive someone not because they deserved it, but because you needed the peace? Or maybe you are the one waiting to be forgiven. We read every single comment, and your words mean everything to us. And wherever you are watching from tonight, whether you are in a quiet room in Canada, a busy city in Nigeria, a small town in the American South, a flat in London, or anywhere else in this wide world, know that you are not alone in the complicated, beautiful, difficult work of being human. Some harvests do not grow from perfect seasons. They grow from the soil that survived drought. They grow from the ground that was broken open, exposed to the cold, and somehow still managed to hold a seed long enough for it to grow toward the light. David and Elaine did not get their marriage back, but they got something they had lost far longer ago, the ability to see each other without the armor. And Emma, dancing under warm lights with the man she had chosen, did not know the full details of what her parents had worked through in those weeks before the wedding. She only knew what she felt when they walked through that bridal suite door together. She felt, for the first time in her life, that the two halves of her world were no longer pulling in opposite directions. And for her, that was everything. Some stories end with love returning. This one ends with something rarer, with two people choosing to stop being each other's wound, and finding in that choice a kind of freedom neither expected. And if you take nothing else from this story, take this: the person you are most angry at may be carrying something you do not yet understand. And the story you have been telling yourself about them may be missing the chapter that would change everything. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for staying until the very end. If the story stayed with you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and we will see you in the next story, because there is always another story, and the next one you will not want to miss.